to the Iron Files, where we uncover the classical theorists whose names dominate headlines and whose actions change the course of nations. Hans Morgenthau remains one of the most powerful voices in understanding international politics. Born in Germany in 1904, he witnessed the failures of an interwar order that the rise of Nazi dictatorship, experiences that made him deeply skeptical of idealistic promises about peace and cooperation. When he fled Europe and later published his masterpiece, Politics Among Nations in 1948, he argued that international politics could only be explained through the lens of power and interest, not through lofty ideals or hopes of harmony. At the heart of Morgenthau's thought was the conviction that states, like individuals, are driven by a will to power. For him, this was not a matter of choices, but of human nature itself. Leaders and nations pursue survival, security, and influence even when they cloak their actions in the language of morality. This insight still speaks to the modern world. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the Kremlin justified its war in terms of protecting ethnic Russian and resisting NATO's expansion. But through Morgenthau's realistic lens, the invasion is better explained as a quest for power and security in a region of Moscow considers vital to its interests. Similarly, the Western response, vast arms deliveries to Ukraine, sweeping sanctions against Russia, and the strengthening of NATO reflects the realist idea that states act above all to preserve balance and defend their national interest. Morgenthau also warned leaders about the dangers of normal crusades in foreign policy. He often criticized American leaders during the Cold War for framing conflicts as struggle between good and evil. In today's context, we can see echoes of this in the rhetoric between the United States and China. Washington described the rivalry and contest between democracy and authoritarianism, but behind this moral framing lies the realist reality. Two great powers competing for influence in Asia, technology supremacy, and control over the global order. Morgenthau will remind us that leaders who ignore the reality of power in pursuit of idealism often stumble into disaster. Yet Morgenthau's realism was not a call for reckless ambition. He emphasized prudence, balance, and restraint. He believed statesmen must recognize limit and avoid outreach. His warning rang true in America's long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which tried to spread democracy but ended in exhaustion and instability. In this sense, Morgenthau's call for realism, to see the world as it is, not as we wish to be, remain urgent today. He showed that the struggle for power is tragic but also manageable if leaders pursue balance, negotiate wisely, and never lose sight of the limit of human ambition. On the other hand, another scholar by the name Kenneth Waltz, writings a generation after Morgenthau, gave realism a new form that continued to shape how scholars and policymakers see the world. Both in the United States in 1924, Waltz lived through the Second World War and Cold War. His great contribution came in 1979 with the publication of Theory of International Politics, where he introduced structural realism, also known as neo-realism. Waltz argued that international politics is shaped not so much by human nature, as Morgenthau believed, but by the structure of international system itself. The world is anarchic. There is no global government to protect states. Because of this, every state lives in fear that others might gain an advantage, and so they act in ways to secure themselves, regardless of who is in power. For Waltz, the distribution of power, whether unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar, determines the behavior of states and the likelihood of war. This structural perspective remains essential to making sense of world politics today. During the Cold War, the bipolar rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union created stability through balance. Each side knew that the other could retaliate with nuclear weapons, a condition Waltz argued made the world paradoxically safer. After the Cold War, when the United States stood alone and the world's unipolar power, Waltz predicted that other states would eventually rise to balance it. We see this today in the rise of China, which challenges American dominance in Asia, and in the resurgence of Russia, which seeks influence in Europe and the Middle East. Waltz also made a proactive argument about nuclear weapons. He believed that in some cases, nuclear proliferation could actually make the world safer because it deters wars between nuclear powers. His logic is visible in South Asia. Despite their bitter rivalry, India and Pakistan have avoided large-scale war since both became nuclear armed, because each knows the risk of escalation. In the same way, the fear of nuclear confrontation between NATO and Russia helps explain why Ukraine war, though brutal, has not drawn in direct NATO-Russia combat. Walt's insight reminds us that power at the systematic level often dictates restraint. Unlike Morgenthau, Waltz did not care much about the personalities of leaders or their moral choices. To him, even well-meaning leaders are forced by the system to behave similarly. Whether it is Joe Biden in Washington, Xi Jinping in Beijing, or Vladimir Putin in Moscow, all are constrained by the same anarchic system that demands self-help and vigilance. Just as companies must compete to survive in a market, states must compete in the international system or risk extinction. World structural realism thus provides a framework for understanding not only the Cold War, but also the 21st century's shifting power dynamics. In the United States versus China rivalry, NATO's expansion, Russia's assertiveness, and the growing talk of multipolarity with powers like India and Brazil rising, all of these developments reflect his claim that the distribution of power shapes behavior more than ideology or individual choices. His work remains one of the most powerful lenses of making sense of the world today. Together, Morgenthau and Waltz represent two generations of realism. Morgenthau grounded politics in the flawed nature of humanity, reminding us of the ambition and the fear that drive leaders. Waltz shifted the focus to structure, showing us how the system itself compels states to act in ways that preserve balance and survival. Their ideas continue to explain why leaders and nations behave as they do, why wars are fought, why alliances are formed, and why peace is so fragile. In today's world of shifting power, nuclear dangers, and geopolitical rivalry, their voices remain not just historical, but urgently relevant.